Hello, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the first of KPMG's Rethinking panels. The second one's going to follow half an hour after this one, next door on freight corridors, if anyone's interested in that as a subsequent session. And then the other three will be tomorrow in one of the upstairs rooms. But it's really nice to see you all today. Today we're going to be looking at the deployment of connected and autonomous mobility and looking at how we can deploy these digital services in the right time, the right place, and what the role of self-driving vehicles could be when you're looking at it as a place-based transformation program, and what capabilities are required when looking at combined authorities, local transport authorities, and how we can bring that out. Really pleased today to be joined by four very different views, I would say, on this, hopefully. I'm hoping, I have warned them that it would be really good to have some not too much agreement today so that we can have a good discussion. Covering Chris from Transport for West Midlands, looking at the combined authority angle. We have Aaron from Coventry University, who has a real focus on accessibility and inclusion and how we can make sure we drive that forward. Robert, who's head of customer from KPMG. So again, looking at that very much customer focus. Why are we doing this? What are the outcomes from the customer? And Jamie from Waymo. I'm going to give them a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, if they want to say more than that. And then I'm going to hand over to Jamie for about 5 minutes, just to kind of give us a bit of insight into Waymo, a bit of an amble into it before we kind of go on to the panel questions. So I'm going to start with this end to Jamie.
Thank you. So Jamie Hodgson, I'm Policy Manager for UK and Western Europe at Waymo. So focusing on our policy delivery in the UK.
Robert Jedrin, nice to see you all. I lead our customer experience and service design teams at KPMG, helping clients think about what the impact is they want to deliver for customers and how to do that in a way that generates both business value and customer value.
Afternoon, everyone. Aaron O'Lahannon from Coventry University. So I'm assistant professor there, so primarily looking at future transport and from taking a user research point of view on that. And primarily most of the work we do is around accessible transport and working with disabled people.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Chris Lane. I'm from Transport for West Midlands. We're part of the West Midlands Combined Authority. Just down the road in the West Midlands, we've got three cities, Coventry, Wolverhampton and Birmingham. I'll obviously put Coventry first. Yes, we're very similar to the work that Transport for Greater Manchester does up here. And my team have been leading on the what next in transport, particularly automated vehicles.
Jamie.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing this for sort of roughly 6 years now, and it's really interesting to see where we began. So government has been thinking about this for over 10 years, and obviously industry has been doing that for a while, including Waymo. And we're now getting to a situation where we're actually starting to see deployments on the horizon, real driverless deployments. And I thought I would start by setting out kind of where are we at, sort of what's happening at the moment. So there's really sort of two key legislative pieces that are unlocking what's happening this year and beyond. So government has talked about creating a commercial piloting regime from spring of 2026. Anyone that works for the civil service will know how flexible spring can be, but fingers crossed. And that's very much about enabling the deployment of this technology this year. And that includes driverless technology. And that's really the process of 10 years worth of work by government, looking at what should the regulatory regime be, and what are we trying to achieve? So what are we trying to get out of self-driving vehicles? And then from the end of next year, we will have the full regime put in place. So the Automated Vehicles Act that received royal assent in 2024, that will fully be brought in next year. And that's when we can expect to see a real expansion of the technology in the UK. And as you may be aware, Waymo has announced that we will be launching our first driverless service outside of the US in London by the end of this year. And so really there's lots of different pieces coming together here that really signal a change for the industry. And I just wanted to say, sort of, historically we focused very much on the technology, and the technology is cool, I agree, but I think there's a risk that we have switched off the most important people, so the people that will use it the most, and also the authorities for whom this technology will have an effect. And we really need to start talking in their language, I think, as an industry in particular, and that's something that Waymo does a lot in the US, and we really hope to replicate in the UK as well. And I think the point here is that although it definitely feels futuristic, it's not science fiction anymore. So Waymo, as a business, we have driven 200 million miles throughout the US with our ride-hailing service. We're offering 400,000 trips per week across the US. We calculated just in 2024, actually, that we were contributing $290 million to economic output in San Francisco alone. And you may have seen some research that was published in the UK recently by Steer and the Chamber for Progress that estimated that for every 1,000 automated ride-hailing journeys in the UK, 800 jobs would be supported as a result. So there are some really compelling figures here just for cities alone and for the economy and for riders. But also from Waymo's perspective, there are three key things, I think, that really we think that the technology delivers. So, of course, one is safety. Safety is really important for us as a business. I get a lot of questions about, yeah, sure, you can deal with the US, but what about London? We've got medieval streets, don't you know? It's totally different. And that's obviously a very important point. But if you look at the elements that make up road safety, and there's a risk that there are people that know far more about this in the room than I, but really you're looking at, particularly density and speed. And if you look at San Francisco, for example, it has a fairly similar density. Speeds can be different. But what we're seeing in San Francisco is that we're really contributing towards a much safer environment for pedestrians. So a 93% improvement rate for just injuries of pedestrians. So that's not killed and seriously injured, that's just injuries overall. And we have confidence that that's something that we can bring to the UK as well. And obviously, for cities looking to move towards Vision Zero, we think Waymo has a really important role to play. There's two other points I'd raise. One is that point around independence. So 73% of assistance dog owners have reported that they have had their access to a vehicle refused because of their guide dog. That's something that Waymo, we will always support the use of guide dogs in our vehicles. We think it's a really important part of providing an accessible service because it's helping to contribute towards that independence of those people that might not feel welcome or willing or able to do that with conventional services. And likewise, I'm sure if you ask people that some people just don't feel safe riding in conventional vehicles at the moment on their own. In a Waymo, it is just you or your friends, and that's a really important part of making people feel safer. And finally, I'd say it's very much to do with integration. So we recognize that the US and the UK are not the same. There's a sort of different approach to transport in Europe compared to the US. But for us, it's still really important to integrate. Air quality targets is something that our full electric fleet can contribute towards. We're investigating at the moment how we can use our technology to identify potholes and biking heat maps in the US, and we would like to bring that to the UK as well. And we know that 36% of our riders in San Francisco use Waymos to get to transport hubs. So we think that Waymo has a role to play in that wider integrated transport system. We think there's a real tangible set of opportunities for the UK in embracing the technology, and we're really looking forward to deploying in the UK.
Thank you, Jamie. So starting as I intended of seeing how we agree and disagree, I'm going to go straight over to Chris because, it's good to hear from the organisations looking to deliver and deploy. But Chris, what's your North Star when it comes to CAM and in this? So how does it align, perhaps, or not?
If we think about the West Midlands, we want it to be the best place for people to work, to live and to belong. And to do that, we've got to have a really good transport system, something that doesn't stop and keeps people moving, gets them to jobs, gets them to education, gets them where they need to be. So anything that CAV does, and we've heard some of this, I think, already, we want to see it reduce harm. So we want to see a reduction in accidents, we want to see a reduction in fatalities on the roads within the West Midlands. We want to see a clean environment, so we want to improve that sustainability. We want to see people be able to do that. We want people to thrive and be economically active, but without having to own their own private car. So again, how can we make that possible? How can we get to that particular point? And I suppose our bottom line is we absolutely don't want to increase congestion. We want to reduce it. So we want to move lots of people to where they need to be in the best place possible. And again, for us, it seemed, well, where can automated help us with that? And I suppose, to put it right up front, one of our big focuses will be automated bus-type services. So we're not saying there isn't a place for ride-sharing services, but actually, what about the bigger public transport, which we see is quite a hard problem to crack.
And Rob, it'd be good to look at the customer, and I think especially building on Chris's point about kind of that shared transport mode for autonomy, any kind of challenges you see around that or opportunities?
Yeah, when you think about what good looks like for customers or what the North Star ambition should be for customers, I think the word that I associate with that, or I keep coming back to, is freedom. Giving people the freedom of movement, freedom of choice. And if you contrast it to broader technologies that involve connecting people and automating certain services, so think about social media, maybe the smartphone, maybe search engines, things that connect people to each other, connect people to products and services. The lessons we've learned from those things, particularly on the downsides, are when it restricts freedom, when it feels like your choices are not your own, maybe you're being nudged by an algorithm to make certain decisions, when it feels like there isn't enough choice if you choose one platform over another. And I think what good looks like for customers is enabling more freedom of movement and more freedom of choice through these connected and automated technologies.
It's a really key point to build on that freedom, Aaron, because we've heard about the guide dogs and that accessibility at Waymo, but a lot of our accessibility support at the moment is customer service focused. It's not infrastructure designed. People with wheelchairs can't access trains readily. There's no level boarding. Similarly for buses, they need to be put down. And I know there's concerns about safety of different minority groups on transport, especially if it's shared, and what perception, whether it's real or perception, they have on automotive. Have you seen any of this coming through with autonomous and fears around this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Rob. I think that word freedom is really important there, and I think whenever you have a step change in technology like this, which can really kind of change the way people think about mobility, it's very easy, to get swept up, as Jamie said, in kind of saying, "Oh, technology is great. Let's develop technology for the sake of technology," but we can often forget about groups which represent huge portions of our population, which are vastly generally underrepresented in a lot of the transport that exists today. And if you just look at the statistics around just violence against women and girls on transport, and the police, I think, were coming out today with statements around that they'd failed generally in terms of gender inclusion and inclusivity on transport, and then disabled people as well. I mean, there's over 16 million disabled people in the UK, and by and large, the transport experience today is very poor. So, we're not even at the level today, and so something like this could be a massive game changer in kind of enabling mobility, but it's only possible if those people are involved in those conversations, and are in these rooms and are talking to people who are making the decisions, who are developing the technology, because it's only by bringing that lived experience into the room can you actually make the change that's necessary. And often we have a kind of culture that we don't, it's kind of seen as a tick box exercise, to kind of address accessibility, or it's seen as this kind of additional hurdle that we have to get through in order to get our product out there. So we need a culture shift, really, to kind of see this as a great opportunity. And if we make something accessible, the reality is we all benefit from it. And so it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, to really develop a technology which could change the lives for a lot of people.
So we're kind of now at this, if I surmise the North Star we've got, it's freedom for individuals, it's giving people opportunity, giving people that access, and using it as an opportunity to kind of build out this inclusive design, this accessibility for all. That's going to take a lot of players, many of whom are sat here, but also different government departments. I mean, Jamie, you're working around this at the moment and looking at how to deploy Waymo within London. What does the stakeholder landscape look like, and how should the different players start to play to deliver this?
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the benefits here is, as I said, government's been thinking about this for a while. We have a fairly well-developed regulatory regime, and that sets out some key stakeholders. Government, of course, is one of them. The consenting authority, as the terminology goes, that local authority, probably the licensing authority, who you need to speak to, who needs to consent to the service. But something that's really important to Waymo, and is not a regulatory requirement by any means, certainly not in the US, is engagement with the community. So we have, for example, the Waymo Accessibility Network, That's a group of partners who have an interest basically in improving their access to transport, whether they're blind, visually impaired, or they use guide dogs or whatever. That we have a wide variety of stakeholders who we think it's really important to work with to ensure that what we're designing works for them. And that's why our app is so accessible. Because we have worked very closely with a wide variety of stakeholders to make sure that it works for them. And I think that the more the industry thinks beyond just the technology and starts to think about the users, actually, the riders, the passengers, whatever you want to call them, the more successful the technology will be. And actually, for industry, the more likely you are to align with the objectives and values of the relevant authorities that you're seeking to get consent from, because they probably don't care about the technology to some extent. They want to know that the technology is going to improve the life of the people that live in their jurisdiction. And so, it's a really important part for Waymo to work closely with those stakeholders.
And Chris, how do you see your Transport for West Midlands starting to build into this stakeholder landscape and working with Waymo and others?
So I think the really key thing, I think Jamie mentioned it at the start, is that it has to integrate with the larger public transport network. So the worst you can do is have your major infrastructure networks start to fail because people are not using them and using single occupancy vehicles, because that's not going to be good for everybody. So actually finding a way to integrate them is really, really important. I think the other one is making them affordable. So we know within the West Midlands there's quite a large number of people that don't own a car, can't afford to own a car. And what we don't want to do is, if there's, say, a Waymo within the West Midlands or an alternative, that they can afford it and they can access it. So it's not an automated ride for the people that can afford it. For certain groups of people, it must be absolutely inclusive. It must bring everybody in. And for me, it must support that core transport network.
Yeah. Okay. And Robert, I suppose moving on from that customer angle, Jamie's talked about, it being important, being designed, and Chris has looked at this. How does it integrate? How would you see kind of the way you could integrate the customer into that design and that delivery?
I think co-design is the most important thing here. I mean, we all know the analogy of a faster horse. If you asked, someone what you wanted, instead of at the time when cars were invented, they would have said a faster horse. I think you have a similar challenge here in which there are numerous use cases that autonomous and connected vehicles can enable in the future. We don't exactly know which one it will be or how exactly it will play out. So it's really important to have customers in the trials and the pilots co-designing solutions, etc., not just being on the receiving end with the output. And the other thing I'd say, really, it's a very complex stakeholder ecosystem in transport, generally speaking, at the best of times, but with something like this, even more so. But it's really important that all elements of that stakeholder landscape actually have a voice and play a strong role in guiding things, because the tension that exists between the different stakeholders is actually really healthy. You want technologies to be thinking about what are the most complex problems to solve. You want local authorities to be thinking about how to tailor solutions for local communities. You want the government to be creating the principles and the guardrails that enable broader economic growth. All of those need to happen, and where we get into challenges is where they're siloed off and not talking to each other.
Yeah, totally. And turning it on its head, Aaron, same question, but looking now from a barrier point of view, there is barriers to adoption, there's barriers to uptake. What do you see exist at the moment, kind of those key ones that need to be overcome?
Yeah, I think, from some of the work we did, so a bit of context, we kind of spent the last year and a half, 2 years looking exclusively at kind of street barriers, and particularly how that kind of then links to access to transport. And one of the good pieces of work we did was, or what we're trying to do more of, is really engage with our local city council. So Coventry City Council, who, to the credit of highly involved and really want to get involved with our research, and having those kind of open conversations. And we ran a kind of quite frank workshop with them, with several departments from the council. And well, this might not be true for every local authority, but certainly in Coventry's case, it was the case that there were just a lot of internal silos in how the council was structured, and there wasn't a lot of communication between departments, and projects come and go, and often the accessibility side often comes in quite a bit later in the process, by which point it's too late to make any kind of real influence on the project, and it often has a kind of sticking plaster solution. So I think this is one of the key barriers. I think we have a lot of research, universities, but also, within councils and transport authorities. I think we all recognise the issues, but we have to work, I think, closely with our local authorities, with government, with policymakers who can actually make that change, and really get that, again, a kind of culture of integrating research into that policy making and decision making, and also look at the kind of barriers in a kind of organizational sense that exist within these groups that are stopping these changes coming. Because I think we're well aware of them. We just need to now take the actions to get the right people in the room and find solutions to those problems.
We're not going to solve it with the five of us up here, but we need the customer in the room. We need the integrated transport network, the design. How does it fit as a use in the room? We need the guidance from government. We need the local authority ability to make that happen. We need the technology. It's a big question, that how. I mean, I'm going to open it out, but how do we get, you've pointed at Coventry, you've got silos within that organisation delivering. How do you get all of those together to go, actually, we're designing this properly for the needs of the customer and all of those North Star outcomes? I'm throwing it out because that's a challenging question rather than picking on someone.
If I kick off, I think we've had a number of automated vehicle pilots, and we genuinely have quite a broad, diverse partnership. So it includes industry, it includes the technologists, it includes the academics and the universities, it includes the public sector and the local authorities. And by bringing all of those people together and looking at the problem and solving it is a good thing, and it involves the end user.
Yeah.
So how do you, actually, we talked about people with disabilities. We have a current project at the NEC in Birmingham at the moment, and we've got a disability group to come and have a look. Well, what do you think about that? Does it work for you? And actually the answer was no, it doesn't, which is fine. I mean, you're learning, and we need to adapt based on that. So I think we would say, as a combined authority, we don't have all the answers. We absolutely need partners. And I think these things only work if you bring those right people together in the room and you listen to each other and understand what's important.
Yeah. Great. Jamie, you and I have worked on a number of these trials over the last 10 years. And they have been additive in some way, but I would say a lot of them are kind of individual use case focused, not commercial business case focus. Are we now at a point they're turning into kind of build into delivery and into that kind of way that Chris has spoken about?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? The technology is very difficult. And even if you can create a system that you think is safe, you still need to be able to prove that. You still need to have all the systems and processes in place to be able to convince whether a regulator or a user or a city that your system is safe. And that's a huge lift, as they would say in the US. It requires a lot of resource, it requires a lot of expertise. And I think we're at a situation now where Waymo has a lot of experience. We've been doing this for over 5 years. We're bringing a lot of experience to the table. We're also willing to bring that experience to the table. We're willing to bring those stakeholders together. I think if I'm sort of putting my used to work in the UK industry and government hat on, the challenge can be that when you're a company that's so focused on the tech, being able to have the bandwidth to start talking about things beyond just the technology can be really difficult. But I think we're starting to see that happen, right? We're starting to see some companies across the UK sort of say they're going to offer these services. And I think, my view is that they need to follow Waymo's lead in making sure that they are working as closely as possible with those city authorities, with the stakeholders, with users of the technology, to make sure that the technology works, but you also have that commercial business plan that you're actually going to be able to do something with that technology.
Thank you. And going back to these 10 years of trials, I, managed the first trials in London, now started well over 10 years ago. And at the time it was, we're all going to be in driverless cars in 5 years. And I feel there's still the same date every year we go forward, if not further. Yeah. We know we're at a tipping point. The legislation's coming through, the agreements to run the pilots post April. I had April still in my head, not spring. I'll stick with spring now.
April, yeah.
But there's a lot about CAM, and we're looking at, I think, the 2+++ or whatever description people want to have on those level of automation. We've got the North Star, which for London might be in the next 6 months. For different jurisdictions, might be further. What could we see to be adopted today that would actually really help start driving towards those kind of customer aspirations, the outcomes that might not be that full driverless robo-taxi or bus or whatever we're looking at? Chris?
If I could be careful, I think actually what Waymo's doing is starting that process off for like the taxi, the ride share service, and I think that, as you said, will happen now, and I think that will go on. The big gap, I think, for me, is the bus type service. So when you start to think about bigger vehicles and running a bus with multiple people on, what about the non-technical challenges? What about the antisocial behaviour, the fare evasion? It breaks down at midnight. What do you do about it? Where do you clean it? I think all of these things are things that we're really interested in, because we think there will be a contribution to the mass transit network as well as the ride share network. And actually we'd love to see some investment and some focus on how do we start to solve those problems. I think the only real example, we've had Cav Forth and there's some stuff going on in Cambridge, I think, at the moment. But let's start to look at what does one of these look like, because I think it's actually, even though Jamie said it's hard, I think it's significantly harder to do a bus type service than it would be to do a taxi ride share service.
Absolutely. Robert, Aaron, anything you're seeing from a customer side or an accessibility side that says actually if we had this level of CAM, it would really help improve customer outcomes, even if we can't get to the full service yet?
I think.
Yeah, no, please, go.
I think the interesting thing we're at now, the tipping point we're in, so the technology is good enough where we can start to experiment with different types of use cases. And we can actually start to see which ones generate broader economic value and which ones might not necessarily be the right ones to go with. So you're starting to see organizations partner with many operators or OEMs to leverage that driverless or connected technology to do different things, whether that's IKEA delivering your orders directly to you, whether that's grocery personal deliveries, whether that's the ability to actually loan out your personal car as a robo-taxi for particular periods of time where you're not using it, etc. There are myriad use cases that enable more freedom, more productivity, better lives for people, more opportunity that we'll start to see getting trialed now. And it feels almost, my impression I get was we were trying to run before we could walk 10 years ago, and now we're finally at the point where the technology can actually enable all these exciting things so we can see what works and what doesn't.
And if I could add on that, I think the challenge I've had, having done this for some time, is always what does an AV look like? There's always been a challenge with tangibility, and you can have a conversation that goes down 10 rabbit holes because everyone has a different view in their head of what the technology is. And I think the deployment of services like Waymo, and Waymo is not the only one planned to launch in London, it's a specific use case. It will help us learn what the reality of the technology is. It will help us improve our understanding of what we want to achieve with the technology. If we don't have the technology on our roads in the first place, we can't really progress the conversation. So yes, obviously the US and the UK are very different, same in Europe. People are looking for different use cases. Unfortunately, those use cases aren't the ones that are attracting the investment and the money at the moment. But if we have those initial services, like what Waymo is providing, we might be able to get to a point where the technology is more accessible, more available, and we can start to broaden out, what can we do with this technology beyond maybe ride-hailing services? And I think that's a really important point that we have to go through so that we can move the conversation on from saying, well, if we had an automated bus, what would it look like? Because we don't really know at the moment. But hopefully, in the next couple of years, we will learn more.
I think there's, also if we're talking about use cases as well, I think there are probably hundreds that we haven't even thought of yet. And really, it's great that we're getting these kind of real-world trials, because it means that we can actually begin to engage with people and really understand from these all the different types of user journeys that happen. What are the use cases where this kind of technology could be employed? And just to give a small example, at train stations, one of the key barriers that wheelchair users face is that often the ramp is not on the right platform. It's something really simple. They know that they book their passenger assist, they're going to be at this platform at this time, and the ramp's not there, right? It's either not at the station or too many platforms away for a person to physically come and get it. So if we're thinking about kind of automated vehicle technology in a more general sense, could there be something that can ensure that the ramp is at the right platform according to a schedule? it could be a very small, well, I shouldn't say small, but it's a very specific use case that can have a massive impact for a lot of people. So I think the use cases we've described, the bus and the taxi are fantastic and probably the biggest kind of ones, but certainly there are probably hundreds there where on a smaller scale could have quite significant impact. And that's, again, to be led by the user to really kind of understand those, I think is where we need to be.
Yeah, and I think that where Rob said earlier about with the trials earlier, we tried to run before we can walk. I mean, the first trials in London were, the robo-taxis, the self-parking, which I know is very much in the vehicles, freight, and that kind of last mile work that we're doing. And it was very much end goal rather than those actually how to put it up. And the other part of that was it's never been economic business case focus. It's always actually looked at what's the technology outcomes. And one of the challenges I still see coming up quite a lot is this kind of business case commercialisation around a lot of CAM, because you look at London and there are a lot of taxis, there's a lot of Ubers, there's quite a competitive landscape there to bring in. You look at rural areas where there's quite often a need for it. Is there the high utilisation to give the business case? Now, we've spoke some of the customer angles, the accessibility angles. How do we make this business case work and bring in those kind of potentially A&I calculations, access to work, giving people the options in West Mids to get to where they need to bring it out?
Yeah, I mean, sort of to go back to the point that the reason we've been operating successfully for the last 5+ years in the US is because we've made a service that people want. So, the kind of how do you make it viable, how do you make it success? Well, deliver a good service and collaborate with the relevant authorities, be willing to explain the technology to the people that need it to be explained to, be collaborative, make the service work. It's fairly obvious stuff in a way, but some members of industry have struggled with that. But for Waymo, just as much as in the US, in the UK, very, very much looking to make a service that works for cities in as much as users, and also just close working with government to make sure that they're satisfied that what is being put on the roads is safe and will work for the right people.
Chris, you've obviously got the bigger picture for kind of economic growth.
I mean, we've obviously looked at public transport, and actually a lot of public transport is already subsidised before you even think about automating it. One of our big findings is actually by taking a driver out doesn't save you all the money you think it's going to. There's still a lot that you've got to do, and a lot that's involved there. But I think for us is that we'd like to see more real-world trials and proper implementations of services so we can understand those business cases more, actually build them. When we put a service on, we have to decide actually what's the best type of thing. Is it better to put, has Coventry got a very light rail vehicle, a tram, a bus, a train? What's the best mode to put on there? And actually we'd love automated to be part of that mix. But we need to know that actually it's got its own business case and it can stack up against, these other modes. So we really do, we have done some work on business cases, but there's a lot more to do, to actually build that case. So your engineers can actually look at that and say, actually, that's a viable option to consider within the mix.
Yeah. And Aaron, bringing in that kind of A&I perspective where, you are giving access to kind of reports around the purple pound and actually how much value there could be to the economy on kind of making transport more accessible.
Yeah, I think this is, certainly from an accessibility point of view, this is where the research is at the moment it's very limited. It's very difficult to understand, or to very easily put an economic value on an accessibility intervention. And the reality is, if you want to make policy change, you can have all the kind of, surveys and interview transcripts you like, but in the end, without those kind of numbers to say it results in an X% increase in whatever it may be, it's very difficult to bring about that change. And that's something that certainly at Coventry, we're trying to do more work in how do you quantify accessibility interventions, and something we're very interested in developing at the centre. And if you just take an example, it's if we take the example of that, let's say an automated ramp, delivery service that can ensure the ramp's in the right place. If you take that example, how do you quantify how many more journeys are taken? Because there are significant portions of the population who simply don't travel because they know those barriers exist. So we're losing a lot of data, right? We only capture data at the point at which something goes wrong. But what about all those people who just don't even bother to step outside their door because they don't trust the transport system in this country can support them? And so really, we need to, capturing all of that into a figure is something we really need to do. And a lot of the, you mentioned the Green Book, a lot of that is based on, non-disabled interventions, right? So to be able to quantify things that increase accessibility, and again, taking that kind of core concept of if something's accessible, then we all benefit. It's very difficult to put a number on that, but I think we need to move towards that direction, and that's how we can ensure this kind of technology is developed in the right way and implemented correctly.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got about 15 minutes left, maybe a bit longer. It'd be great if we had any questions from the audience. I'm going to try and look, it's bright, so see hand.
Hiya. I'm relatively new to the topic, but I hear maybe your frustration on the fact that things have taken quite a long time in your professional careers to get to this point and maybe to see kind of an implementation next year in London at the very least. I guess the way that I always get to these questions of technology as an outsider is really that word sort of purposive and what we're actually trying to achieve, right? And I do sometimes think, if I'm completely honest with some of these conversations, it feels like we've got the technology and we're trying to find the applications, and that's all well and good, but in a context where we are trying in the last 10, 15, 20 years to be more purposive and vision-led, right, to aim for sustainable transport, to aim to reduce single occupancy in vehicles, to aim to prioritise public transport that really is able to cater for everybody in all areas of our cities, for example, and for active travel too. It does, I mean, I guess I'd love to kind of just provoke you to kind of respond to whether we're not just risking here actually going back kind of 60 years and starting to chase the technology for individual people to sit in cars and congest our streets again, rather than going for the kind of more boring traditional things that we've seen before. And I'm sorry if you've heard that question 20 times, but I'd be particularly interested, to be honest, Jamie, to kind of see where you see that, and if you've also got any use cases of trials of the many that have happened to date, where there are creative ideas about maybe which areas of cities it is relevant for and which ones it isn't, not going into regional centres, all of that kind of stuff. Thank you very much.
No worries. Sorry, could I have your name and where? I was going to ask everyone before, your name and where, which company?
I'm called Lucas Lyko, and I'm here from TFGM, but I don't represent them in that view.
Excellent. Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, look, it's not the first time I've been asked this question in the UK. It's a really relevant question, and I suppose there's lots of different parts to this. From one perspective, the technology can be used in lots of different ways, and the technology is not necessarily in conflict with any other transport mode. We're not saying that Waymo needs to be deployed and you need to get rid of your buses. There's no reason why you can have Waymo and buses alongside each other, right? We work very closely with both cities and regulators to make sure that what we're doing works for them. Yes, we've been talking to London recently, but we're also going out and talking to other cities and saying, what are you looking for from this technology? And understandably, there's some skepticism. I think it's amusing for me seeing US colleagues experience the classic British skepticism of what's this then, and sort of finding that the glitzy glam adverts don't necessarily work. But I think this technology can be used in first and last mile connector ways. Usually what happens when we deploy in a city is we deploy in a fairly small area to begin with, but then we expand the service. So for example, in San Francisco, we started in a fairly small area, but we now cover 260 square miles, which is essentially the entire Bay Area. And that service can be used for lots of different ways. It can connect up with transport hubs. It can make people feel safe when they're traveling home after a late night out. It doesn't have to displace the existing transport. There is still pretty good public transport in California to some extent, maybe not by European standards, but it is there and it hasn't suffered as a result of Waymo being deployed. Waymo is just offering a different means for people to travel. And so, as I said before, the technology is fairly new still. We will see as the technology becomes more accessible whether there are other companies that are able to attract the investment to make it available for buses. Maybe Waymo would do that as well. Anything's possible. But again, I would make the point that we could wait. We could just not deploy vehicles now, and we could wait to see what happens. But we won't really learn anything. The technology won't develop. We won't improve our understanding of the technology. And so if we can use the opportunity now to put that technology on the roads and open that technology up in the future.
If I could come in, I know I'm chairing, but it's a question I ask a lot, and I think, and Jamie and I have had these discussions, I think there are the places like London where I think, again, it is a valid question. It's not necessarily true. We'll see what happens post-trial, but there are definitely some use cases I see around rural mobility where there are real challenges around actually the access of any transport system, public transport system, active transport system. Things like send transport, where actually you're going to recruit someone who looks after the students on the bus, not be there to drive and then try and do both, where there's real challenges in recruiting those people. And this is why I focus quite a lot on that business and that economic case, and I think the points of Aaron made, trying to bring in actually how do we value that access to work, to education for all users, but particularly focusing on those who can't access it at the moment, because the economic case is a lot less valid in those environments, because that's why there's not a public transport network there at the moment, because we can't make it add up. So I'm really interested to see how it develops for those use cases and also the smaller ones that Aaron talked about. It's not just full-scale deployment. There are bits that we can use to bring through to help people deliver. I don't know, Chris, if you've got any...
No, I think that observation is really good, is that actually some rural communities and some hard-to-reach areas would really value from a Waymo type solution where they can, the vehicle comes to them and they take them where they need to go. However, the economics of that are much harder to add up, because you see it with the mobile network. In dense areas, you've got fantastic 5G coverage. You get out into the rural areas, it gets worse and worse and worse. And so again, we've got to find a way of actually balancing this being equitable to everybody. Yeah. And that's really hard. I'm not saying that Waymo's here for commercial. I absolutely appreciate that. But how do we, as a public authority, balance that fairness, so that if you live in a hard-to-reach area, you've still got access to these types of services, as if you live in, say, central Manchester?
Yeah, definitely.
And I can't stress the importance of these trials and actually observing what happened and seeing what actually comes back, because often our intuition is very different from what actually happens in practice. For example, I'm very interested in the question of, if you know that you can book a robo-taxi for the first and last mile of your journey, are you more likely to take public transport than to drive? It'd be an interesting thing to observe in terms of customer behavior. It might not necessarily play out in the ways that we normally expect. And that's why it comes back to these use cases. Can we make sure the trials are focused on specific use cases that we can track, observe how people actually behave, and then we can make business cases and actually implement things that are actually added value?
And it's interesting on that point, because with the hired scooters in cities, they actually had a higher carbon footprint than owned scooters, because people were more likely to take the scooter when they previously would have walked. So, and similar stats coming through from electric cars of doing those shorter journeys. It's interesting. Question.
Hello. Dominic Schofield from Cenex. I just wanted to throw out a couple of other use cases, since we're talking about other use cases, and ones which perhaps are more complementary to sustainable development goals. One which you've already mentioned briefly, which is the rural context. So we're working with one rural local authority looking at redesigning the rural bus network with a greater focus on key routes, on the hub routes, and then having smaller vehicles that feed in as shuttle buses. And actually there's a possibility of a trial of one of those shuttle buses being an autonomous vehicle, which is a really interesting use case. The other one, which you've mentioned very briefly in passing, was freight, and thinking about actually large trucks doing trunking on the motorway network, where it's a much simpler environment. Those vehicles, if they haven't got a driver in, they can take longer to do the journey. So the vehicle stopping and charging en route is not so much of a problem. And of course, without a driver, it can do the journey overnight and put less strain on the road network. So there's I think, quite a compelling case evolving for those. And I just wondered what the panel's sort of experience of that kind of use case was, and where you see that, how close you think that might be.
I think the freight use case is a really interesting one. I think the early trials that were done a while ago on platooning. I know there's a lot of challenges. You don't talk about platooning, but there are, because it is a simpler case, and as you say, I don't think it's something that's actually been explored, but I know driver shortage is another big problem in that industry, and getting them through, and potentially similar coach travel. So yeah, I think not many people are highways focused here, so it's, yeah, on that one.
I mean, I would say Waymo used to do a trucking service. We refocused ourselves on the ride-hailing market because it was identified as the best way to market. I think I've worked at other companies, other AV companies that have looked at shuttling and other use cases, and it's really difficult. The tech is really hard to develop. It's very expensive to develop, and there's an understandable sort of skepticism maybe with the public authorities that would be your key customers, because they're saying, well, maybe, but let's see how things go. And the challenge there is that if you're a company looking to bring automated shuttling or freight or whatever, you really need those customers to want to buy it now. But they're not going to buy it now because it's not proven. and so I think, again, to sound like a broken record, the value of bringing autonomy through companies like Waymo is that it's a real thing. There are 200 million miles have been driven in the US, 400,000 trips a week. It's a thing that's happening. And we can learn a lot from it, and we can move the conversation forward.
Yeah, could I add a little bit about freight? I think it is an interesting use case. We're not necessarily the best country to do that. Longer distances in other countries actually are more suited to a truck gets on, drives itself for hundreds of miles, and then jumps off again. So again, it's another one where maybe we become fast followers and wait till somebody's perfected it, and then we'll have some of those trucks over here.
In China, autonomous trucks are driving 200,000 miles a day already.
Big country.
Big country.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, one here as well.
David Heitch. Sorry, unattached. In a way. A couple of things. I really support the work on rural communities, living in one, and living with roads that were designed to enable two horses to pass in either direction. Going to make it a challenge for any motor vehicle, although apparently not for tractors. The other one that came up was about Send, and certainly Send, where there is a number of children or young people on a bus, they can't do that without a carer there as well, if only to give them some degree of security and knowing there's going to be a face they know. Driver can change, they're not interested, but having a carer there constantly. The third one is slightly more basic, and we've concentrated on the technology. We've looked at use cases for cars. There have been some good examples of public transport vehicles. The Forth Road Bridge is a good one up in Scotland, and there are others, I'm sure, coming along. But it strikes me that we have a woeful lack of investment in the size of vehicles needed and would be appropriate in the UK bus industry. So no apologies to any bus manufacturers in this room. But it's noticeable that Waymo are currently using I-Pace Jaguars. Good for them. But we really should be thinking about how we make this work in the longer term. The West Midlands, I'm amazed, Centre of Automotive Engineering for 120 years or whatever, doesn't have a manufacturer of appropriate autonomous vehicles, although they've had, 15, 20 different trials over the last 10 years. So I think there's a factor there which needs addressing. There's also this thing about remote operation. So even where the driver is not there, level 4, level 5, whatever, there are remote operator systems which are being trialed, being tested. Clearly, they have some issues. As Chris has said, not everywhere is fortunate to have 5G. Some of us are lucky to have Edge most of the time. And there's even a village nearby, which is the residence of the Duke of Somerset, who used to have some power in this country, who they have an absolute black spot. There's no coverage of any mobile service 5 miles north and south. Whether this is the revenge of the Duke of Northumberland from medieval times, I don't know, but that's the way it is today. So I think we need to be very conscious that if we're going to do it, yes, great in the cities, wonderful places, but it's actually the less populated areas, not entirely rural, but the less populated areas and the patchiness that we get going through those areas, which is critical.
Can I come back on the bus point? So sort of taking away my hat off a bit and sort of previous experience, but it's a really fair point. And I think the challenge here is that, well, one thing I would say is Alexander Dennis are doing a lot of work in automated vehicles. I'm not paid by them, obviously, but they are working in this space. The challenge when Waymo or anyone really in this sector speaks to vehicle manufacturers, because none of us are vehicle manufacturers, it's a really complicated thing to do in addition to designing a self-driving system. They don't see that there is, you have a sort of couple of hundred units, right? And for them, the business case doesn't exist to build a bespoke automated bus yet, because they say, well, you're only going to order 500 vehicles from us. And that's not enough. We work in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And so they're just, we're a bit stuck. And the self-driving vehicle industry doesn't actually build vehicles, as I said. So, it's fine for Waymo. There is money available to go and speak to these different manufacturers. But for homegrown UK industry, for example, they don't have the money to incentivize that. And unfortunately, they just can't win that conversation with vehicle manufacturers. And so the focus is on conventional vehicles, conventional cars.
If you look in a slightly different industry, if you look at ticketing, TfL and TFGM and Transport for the West Midlands 12, 13 years ago looked at contactless bank cards for use in mass transit ticketing. Sorry, am I allowed to say mass transit in this country? Looked at public transport ticketing, and I mean, TfL had the wherewithal to get on and do it. They had to rope in manufacturers. At that point, there was only one, Cubic, who was capable of managing that sort of service. Now, that was a chance, and it was done by an authority that had sufficiently deep pockets. And given that Waymo's not on its own in terms of the deep pockets that it has access to, in terms of Alphabet and other autonomous vehicle, then I just wonder why that hasn't been exploited, because getting into the market, and I accept that ADL are doing a bit, but they're sort of suffering from not getting an awful lot of support and help from the public sector, frankly.
Can I just pick a bit up on buses as well? So I'm not going to solve David's problems, but it's worth saying we, as Manchester, have just done, and we're about to franchising bus services, so we'll be contracting for bus services, as London has done for many years. We'll be buying buses that will be there for 10 to 15 years. And actually, we need to think about, at some point, will they be automated, semi-automated, etc. So the problem becomes quite urgent for us to actually say, if we're going to buy a vehicle, whoever it's from, are we buying the right vehicle, whether it's a retrofitted or it's got some technology that built in, as you might to an iPace. Can we get the right thing and not just buy something that is redundant in, say, 7 or 8 years' time, when autonomous buses start to emerge and actually none of our vehicles will adapt to it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the freight sector is suffering even harder from that, and for electric vehicles, because of the investment needed now for the length they have it. I think we've got time for one more question here.
Thank you. Anthony Brown, founding partner of Prism Global, and I was actually the Transport Minister who passed the Automated Vehicles Act, as Jamie knows, because he was one of the officials who did the actual work. When we passed that legislation, it's 2 years ago now, I was highly conscious we were passing a regulatory framework for an industry that didn't exist, for a market that didn't exist, for technology that was evolving rapidly, and we had to make all sorts of assumptions about what would happen. And my question really to the panel, 2 years later, it's a long time in autonomous vehicles, is there anything that you would do differently? Is there anything wrong with anything that you would have done in a different way? I was slightly worried that the legislation was too prescriptive, that it would end up throttling innovation. And how has it turned out compared to America, where obviously they've got 50 different regulatory regimes and they're operating in very different ways?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Don't mind me going first. Essentially, the reason that Waymo has come to the UK first out of any other European country is because of the regulatory regime. Because the regime creates a clear sense of who is responsible in the event that something goes wrong. It has very strong sanctions available should things go wrong. There is a criminal duty on the operators to be honest and disclose things appropriately. And if they don't, then the company is under a criminal sanction, and also individual specific people in the company have a personal criminal liability as a result. And that's the sort of clarity and certainty that business needs to invest in the UK. And I think if you look at other jurisdictions around Europe, it's less clear exactly who's responsible, who's on the hook, what's the risk, the cost to us. And so, I think actually, no, I mean, I'm slightly biased. I was involved in the development of the legislation, so I wouldn't say anything's wrong with it. But I do generally believe, it's not just me. There's a reason why Waymo picked the UK first, and it's helping secure certainty for investment and deployment.
I mean, if I can say, I think it's a really decent piece of legislation. I think it's really good. I think the process to get there in the first place was full of consultation. So the industry was talked to, and there was a lot of input. And also with the regulations that are coming forwards now, that there is a really strong engagement and people are listening rather than just consulting for consultation's sake. So I think it's really good. The one thing I'd encourage us to think about is make sure we get any enforcement right once it's in there. It's no point having fantastic legislation and then letting it be a sort of a free-for-all.
Yeah.
It's those standards. It's having standards in the marketplace so people can procure against common standards at the end of the day, and that's where we want to. We want to commoditise this. Sorry, I was Stuart Watkins from Crown Commercial Service, all about procurement and get to those specifications and get to that standardisation. Sorry. And if we can get to those standard specifications and those common markets, then we're off, aren't we? And you have innovation and ubiquitous use of this technology in the not too distant future, if not now. That's what I've heard. Thank you. Sorry.
And I agree with everything, but also the other thing that it does well, and the work that's coming out, is that alignment with international. So actually, people are not procuring, designing, delivering in a completely different way across different jurisdictions, that actually growth can be enabled here, that can be exported effectively, but using the same approach. Okay. Unfortunately, we run out of time for questions and also much of a sum up, but I think those questions were really good, really detailed. Thank you very much, and thank you to my 4 panellists as well today.
Thank you.